You're walking home late at night. The street is empty, quiet. Then suddenly, without warning, every hair on your body stands up. Your stomach tightens. Your heart starts racing. You spin around, and there in the shadows something moves. You can't see it clearly. You didn't hear anything. But somehow you knew. You felt it before your eyes or ears could tell you danger was near. We've all had moments like this. That inexplicable feeling that someone's watching you. The sudden urge to take a different route home that later turns out to have avoided an accident. The dreams that seem to predict events before they happen. We call it intuition, gut feeling, coincidence. We shrug it off because in our modern world these experiences don't fit into neat scientific boxes. But what if they're not just random glitches in our psychology? What if these moments are echoes of something we used to have? Something real, something physical, something we've lost? Today, humans rely on 5 senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. That's it. That's our toolkit for understanding reality. But here's the thing that should make you pause. Almost every ancient culture, completely isolated from each other, talked about additional senses. The third eye in India, the inner vision of Egyptian mystics, the way shamans could sense things beyond normal perception. Aboriginal Australians describe dreamtime awareness. Traditional Chinese medicine maps energy fields the body can supposedly detect. For thousands of years, humans insisted they could perceive things beyond the standard 5 senses. Then something happened. We stopped believing. We called it superstition, primitive thinking, mythology. We congratulated ourselves on being rational, scientific, modern. But what if we were wrong? What if in becoming civilized we didn't just abandon old beliefs? What if we actually lost real biological capabilities? If you're watching this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. Maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I love seeing Tokyo at dawn, Texas at midnight, all these different moments happening at once. The question we're exploring tonight sounds like science fiction, but the evidence is surprisingly real. Did humans once possess a 6th sense? Not magic, not supernatural powers, but actual biological abilities to detect things our modern bodies can't. And if we had these abilities, how did we lose them? The answer takes us on a journey through evolution, through the radical transformation of human society, through the moment when we traded wilderness for cities, intuition for logic, connection with nature for connection with screens. It's a story written in our DNA, buried in archaeological sites, hidden in the capabilities of animals that never lost what we did. See, the animal kingdom is filled with senses we can barely comprehend. Birds that navigate using Earth's magnetic fields. Sharks that detect electrical impulses from beating hearts. Dolphins that map their environment with sound. Even ordinary dogs that seem to know their owner is coming home minutes before they arrive. These aren't supernatural abilities. They're biology. Measurable. Real. Scientific. And here's what keeps scientists up at night. Humans have the genetic remnants of some of these systems. Dormant structures in our brains. Deactivated genes that in our ancestors did something we can no longer do. Organs that have atrophied into useless shadows of what they once were. The evidence suggests that early humans, the ones who survived that near-extinction event 900,000 years ago, the ones who lived in harmony with nature for hundreds of thousands of years, they had capabilities we've forgotten. They could sense changes in weather before storms appeared. They knew where to find water in impossible places. They communicated in ways that went beyond words. They read the world through channels we've closed off. Then came agriculture, then cities, then the modern world. And with each step toward what we call progress, we lost a little more. Our brains rewired themselves. Our bodies adapted to artificial environments. Generation by generation, the sixth sense faded, until most people today don't even believe it ever existed. But some people still feel it. Those moments of inexplicable knowing, that sensation of being watched, the dreams that come true. Maybe these aren't psychological tricks. Maybe they're the last whispers of something ancient, trying to remind us what we used to be. Tonight, we're going to explore how humans lost their sixth sense, what it was, how it worked, why evolution took it away, and the fascinating question of whether we could ever get it back. The story spans millions of years, crosses continents, and challenges everything we think we know about human perception. Because the truth is stranger than you imagine, and it's written in every cell of your body, waiting to be remembered. Before we go further, we need to answer a fundamental question. What exactly is the sixth sense? Ask 10 different people, and you'll get 10 different answers. A psychic might tell you it's the ability to perceive the future or communicate with the dead. A neuroscientist might describe proprioception, your body's ability to sense its position in space without looking. A historian might point to ancient texts describing mystical abilities that modern humans have supposedly lost. And here's the thing, they might all be partially right. The problem with defining the sixth sense is that we're trying to describe something that exists outside our normal framework of understanding. We have names for the basic 5: sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch. These are clean, simple, easy to understand. Light enters your eye, your brain processes it, you see. Sound waves hit your eardrum, you hear. But what do you call the ability to know someone's watching you, even when you can't see them? What do you call the feeling that makes you suddenly change your walking route minutes before an accident occurs on your usual path? What do you call the inexplicable certainty that something important is about to happen? Throughout history, different cultures have had different names for this phenomenon. The ancient Egyptians called it the Eye of Horus, a mystical perception that could see beyond the physical world. Hindu and Buddhist traditions spoke of the Ajna, the third eye chakra located between your eyebrows, supposedly the seat of intuition and foresight. Chinese philosophers described qi sensitivity, the ability to perceive and manipulate life energy flowing through all things. Native American traditions talked about spirit sight, a heightened awareness of the interconnected web of life. Medieval Europeans called it second sight, particularly common in Celtic regions where certain individuals were said to perceive events happening far away or glimpse the future. But these weren't just abstract spiritual concepts. They described real, practical abilities that people claim to experience, abilities that help them survive. The hunter who could sense where animals would appear before seeing any tracks. The healer who knew which plants would cure which ailments without formal training. The navigator who could find their way across trackless wastes using nothing but intuition. The elder who could predict weather changes days in advance with uncanny accuracy. Were these people accessing some form of perception that most humans today have lost? Modern science has started to provide some interesting answers, though probably not the ones most people expect. It turns out we have way more than 5 senses. Depending on how you count, humans possess anywhere from 9 to 21 distinct sensory systems. And yes, most people don't even know they exist. Start with proprioception, the sense that tells you where your body parts are without looking. Close your eyes and touch your nose with your finger. Easy, right? That's proprioception. It might not sound mystical, but think about what it represents. Your brain is constantly tracking the position and movement of every part of your body in 3-dimensional space, updating this information hundreds of times per second, all without conscious effort. You're navigating reality using a sensory system you didn't even know you had. Your ancestors relied on this far more heavily than you do. When you're tracking prey through dense forest or climbing rocky terrain in low light, proprioception isn't just useful, it's the difference between life and death. Then there's equilibrioception, your sense of balance. Controlled by the vestibular system in your inner ear, it detects gravity, acceleration, rotation. It's why you can walk without falling over, why you get dizzy when you spin, why motion sickness exists. Again, not traditionally mysterious, but absolutely crucial for survival. And again, something your ancestors would have developed far more acutely than most modern humans. Temperature perception, thermoception, is another sense distinct from touch. You have separate receptors for heat and cold distributed across your skin. Your ancestors needed this to avoid hypothermia and heat stroke in environments without climate control. They could probably detect temperature changes far more subtly than you can. Pain perception, nociception, is its own sense too, with specialized receptors that detect tissue damage and potential threats. Not pleasant, but evolutionarily essential. Without it, you'd injure yourself constantly without realizing it. Time perception is where things get interesting. Your brain has an internal clock, multiple clock systems actually, operating at different scales. Circadian rhythms governing sleep and wake cycles. Interval timing that lets you estimate durations. Millisecond timing that coordinates movement and speech. But time perception is highly variable and subjective. Stress, danger, novelty, they all warp your sense of time. Your ancestors, living in constant awareness of their environment, probably experience time very differently than you do, trapped in artificial schedules and staring at screens. Now we get to the really fascinating ones. The senses that science recognizes but that sound like something from a fantasy novel. Magnetoreception, the ability to sense magnetic fields. Many animals have this. Birds use it to migrate thousands of miles with perfect accuracy. Sea turtles navigate entire oceans using magnetic maps. Some mammals, including dogs and cattle, can detect magnetic north. But humans? For decades, scientists assumed we'd lost this ability entirely. Then, in 2019, researchers at Caltech discovered that human brains do respond to changes in magnetic fields, we just don't consciously perceive it. The hardware is still there, buried in our biology. We just don't know we're using it anymore. But there's evidence that our ancestors might have been more consciously aware of this sense. Studies of traditional navigation techniques among Pacific Islanders and Aboriginal Australians show they could orient themselves with accuracy that seems impossible, using only the 5 basic senses. They weren't using compasses or maps, they were using something else, something we've forgotten how to access. Electroreception is another one, the ability to sense electrical fields. Many aquatic animals have this. Sharks detect the electrical impulses from prey animals' muscles. Platypuses find food in murky water by sensing bioelectric fields. Some scientists think humans retain vestigial electroreceptive abilities. That tingling feeling before a thunderstorm might not be purely atmospheric pressure. Could be your nervous system detecting changes in the electrical field around you. Then there's what researchers call interoception, your sense of your internal bodily states. Hunger, thirst, need to breathe, heart rate, digestion. You're constantly monitoring dozens of physiological signals without thinking about it. But interoception goes deeper than basic bodily needs. It's intimately connected to emotion and intuition. That gut feeling that something's wrong, that's your interoceptive system detecting subtle changes in your physiology, changes that your conscious mind hasn't caught up with yet. This is where the scientific understanding of extra senses starts to overlap with the traditional concept of intuition. Modern neuroscience has discovered that your brain processes far more information than ever reaches your conscious awareness. Your senses are constantly feeding your brain millions of data points every second. Visual information, sounds, smells, temperature changes, air pressure variations, electromagnetic fluctuations. Your conscious mind can only handle a tiny fraction of this input, maybe 40 to 50 bits per second out of the 11 million bits your sensory systems collect. But your unconscious mind processes everything. It detects patterns, identifies threats, makes predictions about what's going to happen next. Then it communicates this information to your conscious mind through feelings, hunches, sudden urges to do or not do something. This is intuition. Not magic, but the output of massively parallel sensory processing happening beneath conscious awareness. Your ancestors lived or died based on the accuracy of their intuition. The one who felt uneasy about a particular water source and convinced the group to go elsewhere, avoiding contaminated water. The one who sensed predators nearby before seeing or hearing anything obvious, keeping their family safe. The one who intuited which roots were poisonous and which were nutritious, ensuring their children ate well. Over hundreds of thousands of years, natural selection would have strongly favoured individuals with accurate intuition, refining these abilities generation after generation. But here's what's crucial to understand. These abilities only work when you're deeply connected to your environment and your own physiological responses, when you're paying attention, when you're present. Your ancestors lived in a state of what we might call relaxed alertness. Not paranoid or hypervigilant, but aware, always aware. They noticed things. The subtle shift in wind direction that meant weather was changing. The unusual silence that indicated a predator nearby. The slight variation in plant growth that revealed underground water. The quality of light that predicted the coming season. They experienced the world through a richer sensory palette than most modern humans can imagine. Not because they had different biology, though evolution has changed us somewhat, but because they paid attention to sensory information that we've learned to ignore. They trusted feelings that we've been taught to dismiss as irrational. They cultivated awareness that we've traded for distraction. This wasn't supernatural, it was natural. The default human experience for hundreds of thousands of years. It's we who are unusual. We who have dulled our senses through disuse. We who have lost the ability to hear the quiet voice of intuition beneath the noise of modern life. So when we talk about the sixth sense, we're not really talking about one thing. We're talking about a constellation of abilities. Some are scientifically recognized sensory systems like proprioception and magnetoreception that most people don't even know they possess. Some are unconscious pattern recognition and intuitive processing that our ancestors relied on, but we've forgotten how to trust. And some might be perceptual abilities that we've truly lost, that once helped humans navigate reality, but atrophied as we built civilization and stopped needing them. The real question isn't whether the sixth sense exists, it's why we stopped using it. And that story begins with what happened to our ancestors after they spread across the planet. When they stopped being hunters and gatherers living in intimate connection with their environment and started becoming something else entirely. Something safer, more comfortable, but also more disconnected from the sensory richness that had defined human existence since the beginning. Picture this. You're standing in the African savannah 200,000 years ago. No smartphone, no weather app, no GPS. Just you, your small group, and several million square miles of wilderness that wants you dead. Lions hiding in the tall grass, hyenas circling your camp at night, storms forming on horizons 50 miles away, poisonous plants that look almost identical to edible ones, water sources that might be contaminated, clans of rival humans who might kill you on sight. Your ancestors survived all of this for hundreds of thousands of years, and they did it without any of the tools we consider essential today. No written language to record which plants were safe. No maps to show where water could be found. No weather forecast to warn of approaching storms. So how did they do it? How did they survive when literally everything was trying to kill them? The answer is both simple and profound. They had sensory abilities that we've almost completely lost. Abilities so alien to modern humans that when we hear about them, they sound like superpowers from science fiction. But they weren't superpowers. They were survival necessities, standard equipment for any human who wanted to live long enough to have children. Start with the most basic challenge, finding food. Modern humans go to supermarkets. We read labels, check prices, maybe scan nutrition information. Our ancestors had to identify hundreds of plant species by sight, smell, and touch. They had to know which ones were edible, which were medicinal, which would kill you in minutes. And here's the thing, they didn't just memorize this information intellectually, they knew it, viscerally, instinctively, the way you know not to touch a hot stove. Archaeological evidence suggests early humans could identify edible plants from distances of 100 yards or more. They could smell water sources miles away. They could taste trace minerals in soil and know whether an area would have good plants or dangerous ones. This wasn't magic, it was neurology. Their brains dedicated vastly more processing power to sensory information than ours do. Modern humans use maybe 10% of our brain's capacity for direct sensory processing. The rest is tied up in abstract thinking, language, memory, planning. Our ancestors probably had that ratio reversed, but it went deeper than just better senses. They had integration. Their brains connected sensory information in ways ours don't anymore. They could feel atmospheric pressure changes and know a storm was coming 3 days before it arrived. They could sense electromagnetic shifts and predict earthquakes. They could detect infrasound, those deep bass frequencies below human hearing range that animals produce when they're agitated or aggressive. Think about what this means. You're sleeping in a crude shelter. Absolute darkness. Suddenly you wake up. Not because you heard something, not because you saw something. You just know with absolute certainty that there's a predator nearby. You can't explain how you know, but you do. And you're right. There's a leopard circling your camp 50 yards away, moving silently through the grass. This wasn't intuition, in the vague sense we use the word today. This was your brain processing hundreds of microsignals simultaneously. Tiny changes in air pressure as something large moved nearby. Infinitesimal sounds, too quiet to consciously register, but loud enough for your auditory cortex to detect. Changes in the electromagnetic field that all living things produce. Your ancestors' brains were constantly running this analysis, below the threshold of conscious awareness, alerting them to danger before they could articulate why they felt afraid. Now let's talk about the pineal gland. This tiny structure, about the size of a grain of rice, sits near the center of your brain. Modern medicine knows it produces melatonin and regulates sleep cycles, but ancient cultures called it the third eye, the seat of spiritual vision, the gateway to higher consciousness. Were they just being poetic, or did they know something we've forgotten? Here's where it gets interesting. The pineal gland is actually a photoreceptor. It contains cells similar to those in your retina. In many vertebrates, particularly reptiles and amphibians, the pineal gland sits right beneath a thin patch of skull and literally functions as a primitive third eye, detecting light and darkness. In humans, it's buried deep in the brain, but it still responds to light, even though no light reaches it directly. It somehow knows when it's day or night, when seasons are changing, when lunar cycles are shifting. But it does more than that. The pineal gland contains the highest concentration of serotonin in the body, and it's one of the only parts of the brain not protected by the blood-brain barrier. It's also loaded with receptors for molecules that shouldn't be there according to mainstream neuroscience. Receptors for electromagnetic fields, crystals of calcium carbonate that make it sensitive to magnetic field variations. Some researchers think the pineal gland might be a kind of biological magnetometer, allowing humans to sense the Earth's magnetic field the way migratory birds do. There's evidence our ancestors used this capability for navigation. Hunter-gatherer peoples could travel hundreds of miles through featureless terrain, forests with no landmarks, deserts with no trails, and find their way back home with perfect accuracy. They didn't use the stars exclusively. Many could navigate on overcast nights with no visible celestial cues. They could feel direction the way you feel temperature, an internal compass that modern humans have almost completely lost. Indigenous peoples who maintain traditional lifestyles still demonstrate some of these abilities. Australian Aboriginal peoples can navigate the outback using what they call songlines, mental maps encoded in stories and songs. But they also report being able to feel direction, to know where water is without seeing it, to sense when animals are nearby even with no visible signs. Studies of the Hadza people in Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies, show they can detect approaching humans from distances of over 1 kilometre, not by seeing or hearing them, but by what they describe as a feeling, a disturbance in the environment. When researchers tried to quantify this, they found the Hadza were responding to combinations of microsignals, infrasound from footsteps, changes in air currents, possibly even electromagnetic signatures that their brains processed automatically. The San people of the Kalahari Desert can track animals across terrain where modern humans see nothing. They read stories in disturbed sand, crushed vegetation, the way sunlight hits a leaf. But they also report feeling animals' presence, knowing when they're being watched, sensing when predators are hunting even when there's no evidence a modern scientist would consider valid. Yet they're right with statistical significance far beyond chance. What was happening in our ancestors' brains that isn't happening in ours? Neuroscientists are starting to piece it together. The human brain hasn't gotten smaller since we were hunter-gatherers. If anything, it's slightly larger, but it's been reorganized. The areas responsible for direct sensory processing have shrunk. The areas responsible for abstract thinking, language, and social cognition have expanded dramatically. There's a theory called the cognitive trade-off hypothesis. It suggests that as humans developed language and symbolic thinking, we necessarily lost some of our immediate sensory processing abilities. You can't have it both ways. Either your brain dedicates resources to living completely in the present moment, processing sensory information with maximum acuity, or it dedicates resources to abstract thinking, planning for the future, communicating complex ideas. Our ancestors made the trade. We gained language, technology, civilization. We lost direct connection to the environment. But the hardware is still there. The neural architecture that allowed hunter-gatherers to sense predators and predict weather hasn't been removed. It's been deactivated, deprioritized, overwritten by other functions. Every human alive still has a pineal gland, still has the neural pathways that once processed electromagnetic information, still has the brain structures that once allowed us to feel approaching danger. Studies using brain imaging show that when modern humans are placed in survival situations, when they're genuinely afraid for their lives, these ancient neural pathways light up again. Soldiers in combat report knowing when ambushes are about to happen. Sailors in storms report sensing weather changes before instruments detect them. People who survive disasters often report having had a feeling something was wrong right before it happened. This isn't mystical, it's neurological. Under extreme stress, when survival is at stake, the modern human brain temporarily downregulates its abstract thinking processes and kicks ancient sensory systems back online. We become, for brief moments, more like our ancestors, more connected to immediate reality, more capable of processing the subtle environmental cues that spell the difference between life and death. Your ancestors lived in that state all the time, not occasionally, not during emergencies, always. Every waking moment was spent in a state of heightened sensory awareness that modern humans only access during peak experiences or life-threatening situations. They could read the environment the way you read this script, effortlessly, automatically, with deep comprehension. They knew when earthquakes were coming because they could feel the piezoelectric effects in rocks. They knew when volcanoes would erupt because they could sense changes in underground water tables. They knew when droughts would break because they could detect moisture patterns in prevailing winds. None of this was supernatural. It was just neurology operating at full capacity, undiminished by the cognitive trade-offs required for civilization. And it wasn't just about survival. These sensory abilities shaped how our ancestors understood reality itself. They didn't experience themselves as separate from nature. They felt connected to it moment by moment through millions of sensory threads we've now severed. They knew, not intellectually but experientially, that they were part of a vast living system, because they could literally feel it. All the time. This was the world humans evolved for. This was normal. What we have now, this detached, sensory-impoverished existence, where we can't feel magnetic fields or sense approaching weather, where we need instruments to tell us things our ancestors knew instinctively. This is the aberration. This is the loss, and it happened remarkably recently. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what other species never lost, because while we were busy trading our sensory superpowers for language and technology, the rest of the animal kingdom kept abilities we've almost forgotten ever existed. While humans were busy losing their ancient sensory abilities, the rest of the animal kingdom held on tight. They didn't just preserve these capabilities, they refined them, enhanced them, built entire survival strategies around them. And every spring, when Arctic terns leave Antarctica and begin their 44,000-mile journey to the Arctic Circle, they're using abilities that your ancestors once possessed, but you've completely forgotten. Let's start with something that should seem impossible, but happens millions of times every day. A loggerhead sea turtle hatches on a beach in Florida. She's about the size of your palm, weighs maybe 2 ounces, and has never seen the ocean before this moment. Within hours of emerging from her egg, she crawls to the water and begins swimming. She won't return to land for 30 years. And when she does, when she's finally ready to lay her own eggs, she'll swim back to the exact same beach where she was born. Not the same region, not the same stretch of coastline, the same beach. After 3 decades and thousands of miles of ocean wandering, she'll navigate back to within a few hundred yards of where her life began. How? She's reading the Earth's magnetic field. The planet generates a massive electromagnetic grid, invisible to human eyes, but as real and tangible to that turtle as the ground beneath your feet is to you. Every location on Earth has a unique magnetic signature, a combination of field intensity and angle that creates a kind of electromagnetic address. That turtle imprinted on her birth beach's magnetic signature as a hatchling. For 30 years she carried that information, comparing every location she visited to the original, and when the time came, she followed that invisible map home with precision that would make GPS engineers jealous. Birds do something even more remarkable. They don't just read the magnetic field, they see it. Specialized proteins in their eyes, cryptochromes, react to magnetic fields by producing visual patterns. When a robin looks north, it's not just knowing which direction is north through some abstract sense. It's literally seeing something different than when it looks south. The magnetic field creates visual information, overlaying the bird's normal vision with directional cues that guide its navigation. This isn't speculation. Scientists have proven it by disrupting the magnetic sense of migrating birds. Put a small magnet near a bird's head, scramble its magnetic perception, and suddenly it can't navigate. The bird doesn't get confused about where it wants to go. It gets confused about where it is. It's like someone suddenly scrambled every street sign and compass in your city. You'd know you wanted to go home, but you'd have no idea which direction home was. Garden warblers migrate from northern Europe to sub-Saharan Africa every winter, a journey of over 5,000 miles. They do this at night, flying over featureless ocean where there are no landmarks, often through complete cloud cover where they can't even see the stars. They're navigating purely by magnetic sense, following invisible lines of force that humans need machines to detect. And they do it with such precision that they arrive at the same wintering grounds, sometimes the same tree, year after year. Now, you might think, sure, but birds need to migrate. They evolved this ability because their survival depends on it. Humans don't migrate like that anymore, so we lost it. But that doesn't explain sharks. They didn't lose something they never needed. They developed something beyond anything humans ever had. Sharks have electroreception, not the ability to detect electromagnetic fields, but the ability to detect the tiny electrical impulses generated by living things. Every time your heart beats, it generates a small electrical current. Every time a muscle contracts, electrical signals fire. These impulses spread out through your body and into the water around you if you're swimming. They're incredibly weak, measured in nanovolts, but a shark can detect them. A great white shark can sense electrical fields as weak as 1/1000th of a volt. That's sensitive enough to detect the heartbeat of a fish buried in sand from several feet away. It's like having a superpower that lets you sense life itself. Sharks have specialized organs called ampullae of Lorenzini, jelly-filled pores in their snouts that act as electromagnetic sensors. When they're hunting in murky water or at night, vision becomes useless. But electroreception works perfectly. They sweep their heads back and forth, scanning for the electrical signature of prey. They can detect a flatfish hiding under 6 inches of sand, completely invisible, betrayed only by the electrical activity of its nervous system. Some species of sharks use this ability to navigate as well, detecting the electrical fields generated by ocean currents flowing through the Earth's magnetic field. They're reading an invisible map that combines both electrical and magnetic information, processing sensory data that humans need rooms full of sophisticated equipment to detect. And it's not just ocean creatures. Come back to land and you'll find abilities that seem almost supernatural. Dogs can detect seizures before they happen, not sometimes, reliably. Trained seizure alert dogs can warn their handlers up to 45 minutes before a seizure occurs, giving them time to take medication or get to a safe place. Nobody knows exactly how they do it. The leading theory is they're detecting subtle changes in their handler's scent caused by neurological changes that precede the seizure. Changes so subtle that the most sensitive chemical analysis equipment can barely detect them. But a dog's nose can. A dog's sense of smell isn't just better than yours. It operates on a completely different scale. You have about 5 million olfactory receptors in your nose. A bloodhound has 300 million. But it's not just the number of receptors, it's how they process the information. The part of a dog's brain devoted to analysing smells is proportionally 40 times larger than yours. They're not just smelling more strongly, they're extracting more information from each smell. Where you might smell beef stew, a dog smells beef, carrots, potatoes, onions, bay leaves, and can probably tell you what the cow ate and whether the carrots were grown in sandy or clay soil. This lets them do things that seem impossible, tracking a person's scent trail that's days old, detecting cancer from a person's breath with accuracy that rivals medical imaging, sensing fear, anxiety, or aggression from the chemical changes these emotions produce in human sweat. They're reading an invisible world of chemical information that's completely inaccessible to human senses. Elephants might have them all beat. They can communicate across distances of up to 6 miles using infrasound, sound so low frequency that human ears can't detect them. When an elephant makes these calls, the sound waves travel through the ground as well as the air. Other elephants detect them both by hearing and by sensing the vibrations through their feet. They're having conversations across distances that would require humans to use phones or radios, and they're doing it with pure biology. But their most mysterious ability is predicting disasters. Elephants famously fled to higher ground before the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. They detected something, possibly the ultra-low frequency sound waves generated by the underwater earthquake, possibly seismic vibrations that travelled faster than the tsunami itself. Whatever it was, they knew danger was coming long before any human did. Dogs did the same thing, refusing to go outside, acting anxious and distressed, all before the wave hit. This isn't isolated to tsunamis. For centuries, people have reported animals behaving strangely before earthquakes. Dogs barking incessantly, birds abandoning their nests, fish jumping out of water. In 1975, Chinese officials evacuated the city of Haicheng based partly on reports of unusual animal behavior. Hours later, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake destroyed the city. The evacuation saved an estimated 100,000 lives. The animals knew something humans didn't. Then there's echolocation. Bats and dolphins navigate and hunt in complete darkness by producing sounds and listening to the echoes. They're not just detecting the presence of objects. They're building detailed three-dimensional mental maps of their environment from sound alone. A dolphin using echolocation can detect a quarter-sized object from 70 meters away, in murky water, at night, where vision is completely useless. The sophistication is staggering. Dolphins can tell the difference between objects made of different materials, copper versus aluminum, plastic versus rubber, based purely on how those materials reflect sound. They're essentially doing materials science with their ears. Bats can detect wires thinner than human hair while flying at full speed through complete darkness. They're processing hundreds of echoes per second, filtering out irrelevant information, building a constantly updating sonic picture of the world around them. Here's what's really interesting. Humans can do this. Not all humans, not easily. But some blind people have taught themselves echolocation. They make clicking sounds with their mouths and learn to navigate by the echoes. And it works. Brain scans show that these individuals process the echoes in their visual cortex, the part of the brain normally used for vision. They're literally seeing with sound. This suggests something profound. The capability was always there. The neural infrastructure to process echolocation information exists in human brains. It just normally gets overridden by vision because vision provides more detailed information in most situations. But when vision isn't available, the brain can repurpose that hardware for processing sound-based spatial information. The ability was dormant, waiting to be activated. And that raises the biggest question of all. If humans have dormant echolocation abilities, what else is sleeping in our neurology? The birds reading magnetic fields do it with proteins that exist in human eyes too. We have cryptochromes. They're there right now, in your retinas, doing other jobs but structurally capable of responding to magnetic fields. The electroreception of sharks depends on specialized organs we don't have, but the nerves that would process that information, those exist in human brains. They just don't receive the input anymore. Evolution doesn't usually delete abilities completely. It's inefficient. The genetic code remains, the neural pathways persist. They just stop being used, stop being maintained, degrade over generations of disuse until they're shadows of what they once were. But they're still there, still capable of being reactivated under the right circumstances. The animal kingdom isn't showing us abilities that humans could never have. They're showing us abilities that humans once had but stopped using, stopped needing, forgot were even possible. And the evidence suggests that somewhere in your ancestry, your species made a trade. Enhanced cognitive abilities, language, abstract reasoning, tool, use. All of this came at a cost. The cost was connection. Connection to the invisible world of magnetic fields, electrical impulses and chemical signals that other species still navigate every day. The question is whether that trade was permanent, or whether those lost senses are simply waiting, dormant in your neurology, ready to wake up if you knew how to call them back. For nearly 2 million years your ancestors were hunters and gatherers. They moved with the seasons, following animal migrations, tracking the ripening of wild fruits, reading weather patterns and cloud formations and the behavior of birds. Every day was a masterclass in environmental awareness. Every moment required attention, intuition, the ability to sense danger before seeing it, to feel changes in the atmosphere before the storm arrived. Then, about 12,000 years ago, everything changed. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a single revolutionary moment where someone planted a seed and humanity suddenly abandoned its nomadic ways. It was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. In the Fertile Crescent, in what is now Iraq, Syria and Turkey, some groups of humans started noticing patterns. Wild wheat and barley grew in such abundance in certain areas that it made sense to stay nearby, to return to the same locations year after year. They began doing something their ancestors had never done for any extended period. They stayed put. The first farmers weren't really farmers as we'd recognize them. They were still hunters and gatherers, but ones who supplemented their diet by encouraging certain plants to grow. Maybe they scattered seeds near their camps. Maybe they protected particularly productive patches of wild grains from animals. Small interventions that gave them slightly more control over their food supply. But even these small changes began altering something fundamental about human consciousness. When you're a hunter-gatherer, your survival depends on constant vigilance. You need to know where every water source is within 100 miles. You need to recognize thousands of different plants, knowing which are edible, which are medicinal, which will kill you. You need to read animal tracks like a book, understanding not just what passed by, but when, how fast it was moving, whether it was healthy or sick, scared or aggressive. This requires a kind of total environmental immersion that most modern humans can barely imagine. Your ancestors didn't just live in nature, they were nature. Their senses were so finely attuned to their surroundings that they could detect changes we'd never notice. A shift in the wind that meant rain was coming 3 days before it arrived. The subtle wrongness in the forest that indicated a predator nearby. The electromagnetic changes that animals sense before earthquakes. They had what we'd now call a sixth sense, though really it was just the full expression of human sensory capability, unfiltered by the noise and distractions of civilization. Then agriculture changed the equation. Within a few thousand years of those first experimental plantings, settled agricultural communities were spreading across the Middle East, Asia, and eventually the world. And with settlement came a fundamental shift in what humans needed to survive. If you're living in a permanent village surrounded by fields of domesticated grain, you don't need to know whether wild wheat grows 100 miles away. You don't need to track animal migrations because you're keeping livestock in pens. You don't need to read the subtle signs of changing weather because you've stored enough grain to survive a bad season. The environmental knowledge that had kept your ancestors alive for millions of years was becoming less critical with each generation. This is where evolutionary biology gets interesting and a little bit brutal. There's a principle called use it or lose it. If a trait isn't providing survival advantages, if it's not helping individuals reproduce more successfully, evolution stops maintaining it. Traits don't disappear overnight, but generation by generation the genetic lottery starts favoring other characteristics. For a hunter-gatherer, heightened intuitive awareness, the ability to sense danger, read environmental cues, pick up on subtle atmospheric changes, these were life or death capabilities. The individuals who had them survived. The ones who didn't often died before reproducing. Strong selection pressure maintaining these abilities across millions of years. But for a farmer, these abilities were still useful, but they weren't essential. You could live a long, successful life, raise many children, without ever developing the kind of sensory acuity your great-great-great-grandfather had needed just to make it through the week. The selection pressure was relaxing. Meanwhile, new selection pressures were emerging. Agriculture created new challenges that had nothing to do with sensing the environment. You needed to plan ahead, coordinating planting and harvest across an entire community. You needed to count and record yields, keep track of stores. You needed to negotiate with neighbors about land and water rights. You needed to organize defense of your territory, because now that you'd accumulated wealth in the form of stored grain and domesticated animals, you had something worth stealing. These challenges favored different cognitive abilities: abstract reasoning, numerical thinking, social intelligence, the ability to navigate complex hierarchies and political structures. Over hundreds of generations, human brains were being pulled in a new direction. Not better or worse, just different. Trading one set of capabilities for another. The archaeological record shows this transformation in fascinating detail. Early agricultural settlements show evidence of increasing specialization. Not everyone is a generalist anymore, capable of performing all the tasks needed for survival. Now you have potters, weavers, toolmakers, traders, each person developing deep expertise in a narrow domain rather than broad competence across all survival skills. This specialization was incredibly powerful. It allowed humans to develop technologies and create social structures that would have been impossible for small hunter-gatherer bands. But it also meant that no individual needed to know everything anymore. You could survive, even thrive, while being completely ignorant of vast domains of practical knowledge that your ancestors had mastered as children. The neurological changes were real and measurable. When scientists compare the brain sizes of early agricultural populations to their hunter-gatherer ancestors, they find something surprising. Starting about 10,000 years ago, average human brain size begins to decrease. Not dramatically, but noticeably. We've lost about 10% of our brain volume since the advent of agriculture. Now, smaller brains don't necessarily mean less intelligent. Brain efficiency matters more than raw size. But the distribution of cognitive resources was definitely changing. Brain imaging studies of modern hunter-gatherer populations show enhanced activity in regions associated with spatial awareness, pattern recognition, and what neuroscientists call interoception, the ability to sense internal body states and environmental changes. Modern agricultural populations show different patterns, enhanced activity in regions associated with language processing, abstract reasoning, and future planning. We've reorganized our neural architecture around the demands of civilized life, but we've lost something in the process. Think about what a day was like for your hunter-gatherer ancestor. She wakes before dawn, immediately aware of the temperature, the wind direction, the sounds of the forest. She can tell from the bird calls whether predators are nearby. She notices that the clouds have a particular texture that means rain in the afternoon. As she gathers food, She's constantly processing thousands of subtle cues, the way sunlight filters through leaves telling her the time and season, the smell of the earth revealing what plants are ripening underground, the electromagnetic sensation in the air before a storm. Her brain is fully engaged with the present moment, processing sensory information at a level most modern humans never approach. She's not thinking about yesterday or tomorrow. She's here now, alive in a way that requires using every capability evolution has given her. Now imagine a farmer in one of the first agricultural villages, just a few thousand years later. He wakes in a permanent house. His day is structured around agricultural tasks that follow predictable patterns. Plant in spring, tend in summer, harvest in fall. The challenges he faces are different. How to store grain so it doesn't rot, how to prevent theft, how to negotiate with the village council about water rights. His attention is focused inward, on social dynamics and future planning, rather than outward, on environmental awareness. He doesn't need to sense the coming storm because his grain is already stored. He doesn't need to read animal behavior because his livestock are penned. The parts of his brain that his ancestors used for environmental sensing are being repurposed for other tasks. Generation by generation, the change accelerates. As villages become towns, towns become cities, the disconnect from direct environmental interaction grows. People begin spending most of their time in human-made environments. Stone buildings, paved streets, organized markets where food appears as if by magic, divorced from any visible connection to the land or seasons. The same abilities that kept humans alive for millions of years are withering from disuse. But here's what makes this story more complex, more interesting than a simple tale of loss. The trade-off wasn't just about giving up old abilities, it was about gaining new ones. The cognitive capabilities that agricultural societies developed, abstract reasoning, technological innovation, complex social organization, these allowed humans to achieve things that would have been impossible for hunter-gatherer bands. Writing, mathematics, architecture, medicine, philosophy. Art that transcended simple representation to explore abstract concepts. All the achievements we associate with civilization required the kind of focused, abstract thinking that agricultural life selected for. The question isn't whether the trade-off was worth it. That's unanswerable, maybe meaningless. The question is whether we can understand what was lost and whether any of it can be recovered. Because here's the thing, the genetic potential is still there. Those 1,280 bottleneck survivors who gave rise to all modern humans, they had heightened sensory awareness. The genes that built their nervous systems are still in your DNA. They haven't disappeared. They've just been turned down, quieted by generations of disuse and changing selection pressures, which means theoretically they could be turned back up again. But the agricultural revolution was just the beginning. What happened next would disconnect us even further from our ancestral abilities. As the first great civilizations rose along the Tigris, Euphrates, Nile, and Indus rivers, humans were about to enter a new phase of their relationship with the sixth sense they were forgetting they'd ever possessed. By the time agriculture took hold and humans began building the first cities, something strange was already happening. Written records from these earlier civilizations, some dating back 5,000 years, show a consistent preoccupation with something invisible, something that existed between the eyebrows, something they called by different names but all recognized as fundamentally the same thing. A pathway to knowledge that didn't come through the ordinary senses. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with it. Walk through any museum with Egyptian artifacts and you'll see it everywhere. The Eye of Horus, one of the most powerful symbols in their entire culture. But here's what's weird. The Eye of Horus isn't just decorative. When you overlay it with modern anatomical drawings of the human brain, something remarkable happens. The symbol maps almost perfectly onto the structures of the brain's limbic system, the thalamus, the corpus callosum, and right at the centre, sitting exactly where the pupil of the eye would be, the pineal gland. Now, the Egyptians didn't have MRI machines. They didn't do brain surgery. So how did they create a symbol that accurately represents the neurological centre of human consciousness? Either it's the most incredible coincidence in history, or they knew something. The Egyptians didn't call it the sixth sense. They called it the eye that sees what is hidden, the eye that perceives truth when ordinary eyes see only illusion. Their priests underwent years of training to develop this inner sight. Temple inscriptions describe elaborate practices, hours of meditation in dark chambers, specific breathing techniques, dietary restrictions, all designed to awaken what they believed was an atrophied sense. They wrote about it like it was something humans once possessed naturally, but had lost, like a muscle that had weakened through disuse. The most advanced practitioners, the high priests and scribes who could access this hidden sight, were treated as the most valuable members of society. They advised pharaohs, made predictions about the Nile's flooding, diagnosed diseases before symptoms appeared. Were they just clever con artists? Maybe. Or maybe they'd figured out how to access something real, something the rest of their society was losing. Meanwhile, halfway across the ancient world, a completely separate civilization was documenting the exact same phenomenon. The Vedic texts of ancient India, some of them potentially older than Egyptian civilization itself, describe in extraordinary detail what they called the Ajna chakra, the third eye, located precisely where the Egyptians placed their eye of Horus, between and slightly above the eyebrows, at the exact position of the pineal gland. But the Indian traditions went deeper than symbols. They created systematic practices, detailed instructions for awakening this dormant sense. The earliest yogic texts, thousands of years old, don't treat the third eye as metaphor or poetry. They describe it as an actual perceptual organ, one that could be trained and developed just like you'd train your muscles or sharpen your hearing. They claimed that every human was born with this capacity, but that most people let it atrophy, never learning to use it, never even knowing it existed. The techniques they developed to reawaken it were precise and demanding. Specific meditation postures designed to direct awareness to the center of the forehead, breathing exercises that altered oxygen flow to the brain, dietary practices that, interestingly, often emphasized foods rich in serotonin precursors, the same neurochemicals modern science now knows are produced by the pineal gland. They weren't guessing. Somehow, without modern equipment or scientific method, they'd figured out exactly which practices would stimulate this specific region of the brain. And they wrote extensively about what happened when someone successfully awakened their ajna. Enhanced intuition, yes. The ability to sense danger before it manifested. The capacity to understand complex truths without logical reasoning. But also something more, something they called direct knowing, perception that bypassed the ordinary senses entirely. They claimed advanced practitioners could perceive events happening far away, could sense the thoughts and emotions of others, could even access knowledge from what they called the Akashic records, a kind of universal memory of all that had ever occurred. Superstition? Maybe. But here's the thing. These practices spread across the ancient world like wildfire. By 500 BCE, similar techniques had appeared in Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese Taoism, Persian Zoroastrianism. Different cultures, different languages, different explanations, but the same basic understanding. Humans possessed a dormant perceptual ability, located in the same place in the brain, accessible through similar practices. The ancient Greeks were documenting it too, though they approached it differently. Greek philosophers didn't build temples or practice meditation the way Eastern cultures did. They argued, debated, tried to understand through logic and reason. But they kept bumping into the same mystery. Plato wrote extensively about what he called the eye of the soul, a capacity for perception that transcended sensory experience. He distinguished it from regular sight, arguing that this inner eye perceived forms, eternal truths that existed beyond the physical world. Aristotle, despite being more empirically minded than his teacher, couldn't dismiss it either. He wrote about nous, a kind of direct intellectual perception that happened without reasoning, without evidence, just immediate apprehension of truth. He struggled to explain where this capacity came from or how it worked. He just observed that humans sometimes knew things they had no logical way of knowing. The Stoic philosophers went further. They developed practices remarkably similar to Eastern meditation, exercises in focused attention, and a mental discipline they claimed could enhance what they called the inner demon, a guiding intelligence that existed beyond conscious thought. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, wrote about consulting this inner voice before major decisions, trusting perceptions that came from somewhere deeper than reason. But here's what's really interesting. As you move forward through history, as civilizations become more complex and urban and technological, the confidence in these abilities starts to fade. The later Greek philosophers write about the inner eye with less certainty, more skepticism. The practices become more ritualized, more religious, less practical. It's like they're trying to hold on to something they can feel slipping away. Indigenous cultures around the world were dealing with the same problem, but many of them fought harder to preserve these abilities. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia maintained dreamtime practices for potentially 60,000 years, techniques for accessing what they called the dreaming, a state of consciousness where past, present and future collapsed together, where they could perceive connections and patterns invisible to ordinary awareness. Their entire culture was organized around maintaining this capacity. Young people underwent years of training, learning to enter altered states, to interpret the subtle perceptions that arose, to trust knowledge that came without evidence. Native American tribes across both continents developed vision quest traditions, elaborate ceremonies designed to awaken hidden perceptual abilities. Young warriors would fast for days, isolate themselves in wilderness, use specific plants and practices to trigger what they understood as an expansion of consciousness. They weren't seeking religious visions in the way we think of them. They were trying to activate dormant senses, to perceive threats and opportunities their ordinary awareness would miss. African traditional cultures maintained similar practices. San Bushman healers in southern Africa, part of some of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, developed trance dancing techniques that could induce what they called numb, a state of enhanced perception where they claimed they could diagnose illness by seeing disease in the body before physical symptoms appeared. These weren't random rituals. They were systematic practices, refined over thousands of generations, designed to access specific perceptual states. Amazonian shamans went even further. They didn't just practice techniques to enhance perception. They studied plants, spending lifetimes learning which combinations of jungle flora could temporarily reactivate dormant neurological functions. The ayahuasca traditions of the Amazon represent potentially thousands of years of experimental pharmacology, indigenous people systematically testing which plant combinations could open what they called the third eye, could let them see the connections between things, could grant them access to knowledge that shouldn't be accessible. Modern researchers who've studied these traditions in depth keep encountering the same puzzle. These shamans, with no formal education, no microscopes, somehow identified plant combinations that specifically target serotonin receptors in the brain, that stimulate the pineal gland, that alter consciousness in precise, predictable ways. They claim they learned this from the plants themselves. that in altered states they could directly perceive which combinations would produce specific effects. Either they got incredibly lucky through random experimentation, or they developed a real perceptual ability that modern science doesn't acknowledge. But across all these ancient civilizations, one pattern keeps emerging. The more urban they became, the more they built cities and agriculture and complex social hierarchies, the harder they had to work to maintain these abilities. The practices became more elaborate, more time-consuming. Priests had to train for decades. Shamans had to use increasingly powerful plant medicines. It's like they were fighting against something, struggling to keep alive a capacity that was being slowly smothered by the very civilization they were building. The Egyptian texts from later dynasties talk about the ancient wisdom being lost, about practices that used to work effortlessly, requiring more and more discipline. Indian philosophical texts from the first millennium CE describe the Kali Yuga, an age of darkness where human consciousness would degrade, where abilities that had once been natural would become rare and difficult to access. They weren't predicting the future. They were describing what they saw happening around them. Maybe these ancient peoples weren't preserving superstitions. Maybe they were trying desperately to hold on to something real, something they could feel disappearing generation by generation. They built temples and trained priests and developed elaborate practices because they understood something we've forgotten, that humans weren't supposed to perceive the world only through 5 senses, that we'd lost something vital, and that without constant effort, without deliberate practice, that loss would become permanent. By the time we reached the scientific revolution, those practices would seem primitive, the beliefs behind them dismissed as ignorance. But what if the ancient civilizations were right? What if all their elaborate temples and meditation techniques and vision quests were sophisticated attempts to reawaken a sense that agriculture and civilization and urban living had already begun to destroy? Then something happened that would change humanity's relationship with its own mind forever. Not a climate disaster this time, not a genetic bottleneck or a migration crisis. This was something humans did to themselves, something they thought was progress, something they called enlightenment. It started in Europe around the 1600s. A handful of brilliant thinkers decided they were going to figure out how the universe really worked. Not through mysticism or tradition, or the accumulated wisdom of ancestors, but through observation, measurement, and rational analysis. They called it the scientific revolution, and they weren't wrong about its power. Within a few generations, they'd discovered the laws of motion, the circulation of blood, the existence of microorganisms, the mathematical principles that governed planetary orbits. But here's what nobody talks about. With every discovery, with every triumph of rational thought, something else was being lost. Something that had kept humans connected to themselves and to the world around them for hundreds of thousands of years. The man who split the world in two was René Descartes, French philosopher, mathematician, guy who famously said, "I think, therefore I am." Sounds profound, right? Except what he was really doing was drawing a line through the middle of human experience and declaring that only one side was real. Descartes proposed something that would echo through Western thought for the next 4 centuries: the mind-body split. The idea that consciousness, thought, and reason existed in a separate realm from physical matter. The body was just a machine, he said, meat and bone operating according to mechanical principles. The mind was something else entirely, something pure, rational, divorced from the messy biological reality of being human. This might sound like abstract philosophy, but the implications were enormous. If the mind and body are separate, if reason exists apart from physical sensation, then anything the body knows that the mind can't explain must be unreliable, suspect, probably imaginary. That gut feeling that warns you about someone you just met. That's not knowledge, that's superstition. The sense that something's about to happen before it does. Coincidence. The feeling of being watched when nobody visible is around. Your imagination playing tricks on you. The intuitive knowing that comes without logical steps. Can't be trusted. For the first time in human history, there was a philosophical framework that dismissed half of human experience as fundamentally less real than the other half, and Western civilization ran with it. The Enlightenment thinkers who came after Descartes took his ideas and built an entire worldview around them. Francis Bacon declared that nature must be put to the question, interrogated like a criminal until it revealed its secrets. Isaac Newton showed that the universe operated like clockwork, following predictable mathematical laws. John Locke argued that the mind at birth was a blank slate, written on only by sensory experience and rational thought. Everything that could be measured, quantified, reduced to numbers and equations, that was real. Everything else, superstition, primitive thinking, something civilization needed to overcome. The trouble was, humans had been relying on that primitive thinking since before they were technically human. Those instincts weren't primitive at all. They were sophisticated processing systems refined by millions of years of evolution. Systems that could detect patterns too subtle for conscious analysis, process information too complex for rational thought, respond to environmental cues faster than conscious awareness could track. But the scientific revolution had no framework for understanding these abilities, so they were dismissed. And slowly, generation by generation, they began to atrophy. The process accelerated during the Industrial Revolution. Starting in the late 1700s, hundreds of thousands of people moved from farms and villages into cities, from environments where survival still depended partly on reading natural signs, on intuiting weather changes, on sensing the mood of animals, into environments where none of that mattered anymore. In the city, you didn't need to know when rain was coming. You just carried an umbrella. You didn't need to sense danger in the darkness. There were street lights. You didn't need to track the seasons by subtle changes in air and light and the behavior of plants. There was a calendar on the wall. Traditional knowledge that had been passed down for generations, teaching after teaching after teaching, suddenly became irrelevant. Grandmothers who could predict weather 3 days out by watching insects and smelling the air. Old wives' tales. Fathers who could sense when predators were nearby, reading the silence of birds. Unnecessary in a world with fences and guns. Mothers who knew which plants could heal and which could harm. Replaced by doctors with proper medical training. Within a few generations, knowledge that had survived for millennia simply vanished. Not because it was wrong, but because it couldn't be quantified, couldn't be written in textbooks, couldn't be reproduced in laboratory conditions. The people who held this knowledge, usually the old, usually women, usually members of traditional communities, they were marginalized, called superstitious, sometimes worse. The European witch trials that peaked in the 1600s weren't really about witchcraft. They were about destroying traditional knowledge systems that couldn't be controlled or explained by the new rational framework. Women who knew too much about herbs, about healing, about the subtle patterns of nature, they were dangerous to a worldview that insisted only measurable, observable phenomena were real. But perhaps nothing disrupted human sensory connection more than the conquest of darkness. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived according to natural light cycles. When the sun set, darkness came. Not complete darkness, not most of the time. There was firelight, moonlight, starlight. But these were dim, flickering, inconstant sources that kept humans connected to natural rhythms. When darkness fell, the pineal gland, that small organ deep in the brain that ancient traditions called the third eye, began producing melatonin. This wasn't just about sleep. The pineal gland was responding to light cycles that had been consistent since before life crawled out of the oceans. Its rhythms were tied to day and night, to seasons, to the deep pulse of the planet's rotation. In darkness, human consciousness shifted. Not just tiredness, but a different mode of perception. Dreams became more vivid, intuition stronger. The boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness became thinner, more permeable. This was the time when our ancestors processed the day's experiences, integrated knowledge, accessed different types of awareness. Then came electric lighting, first gas lamps in the early 1800s, then Edison's incandescent bulb in 1879. Within a few decades, darkness had been abolished in the industrialized world. Cities blazed with light all night. Factories ran around the clock. People worked night shifts, slept during day, lived according to schedules that had nothing to do with the sun. The pineal gland, that ancient organ that had been regulating human consciousness for millions of years, suddenly received confused signals: light at midnight, darkness at noon, no consistent pattern to anchor to. It tried to adapt, flooding the bloodstream with melatonin at the wrong times, withdrawing it when it should flow. The results were subtle but profound. Sleep disruption, mood disorders, a persistent sense of disconnection from natural rhythms. But more than that, the constant artificial light disrupted the altered states of consciousness that darkness had always facilitated. Those liminal moments between waking and sleeping, when intuitive knowledge could surface, when the rational mind relaxed its grip enough for other types of knowing to emerge, they became harder to access. The boundary between conscious and unconscious, which had been designed to be permeable, became a wall. Scientists dismissed complaints about this as nostalgia. Humans were adaptable, they said. We'd adjust to electric light just as we'd adjusted to every other technological change. And they were partly right. Humans did adapt. We learned to function on disrupted sleep schedules, to ignore our body's signals that something was wrong, to power through the exhaustion with coffee and stimulants. But adaptation isn't the same as thriving, and ignoring signals isn't the same as those signals not existing. By the early 1900s, the transformation was complete. In Western industrialized societies, rational thought had won its total victory over intuition. The scientific method was the only valid way of knowing. Measurable phenomena were the only real phenomena. The mind was separate from the body, and anything the body knew that the mind couldn't explain was dismissed as biological noise. Universities taught this worldview as fact. Doctors learned to treat the body as a machine with interchangeable parts. Psychologists tried to reduce consciousness to stimulus and response, input and output. Philosophers argued about whether subjective experience even existed, or if it was just an illusion created by brain chemistry. And an entire dimension of human experience, capabilities that our ancestors had relied on for survival, abilities that had been refined over millions of years of evolution, they were relegated to the category of superstition, not studied, not investigated, just dismissed. The irony is that the very tools of scientific investigation that were being used to dismiss intuitive knowledge could have been used to understand it. But you can't study what you refuse to acknowledge exists. You can't measure what you've decided isn't real, and you can't reclaim what you've convinced yourself was never lost. But here's the thing about biology. It doesn't care about philosophy. Those ancient systems, the ones refined during the bottleneck and long before, they didn't disappear just because Western civilization decided they weren't real. They were still there, still functioning, still trying to send signals that increasingly nobody knew how to hear. The question wasn't whether humans still had access to intuitive knowledge, to subtle sensory perception, to ways of knowing that couldn't be reduced to rational analysis. The question was whether anyone would remember how to listen, and whether science would ever turn its tools toward understanding what it had spent centuries denying. That reckoning was coming. But it would take another century of disconnection before anyone thought to ask whether the victory of rationality over intuition had been a triumph or a tragedy. Modern life didn't steal your sixth sense all at once. It didn't wake up one morning, flip a switch, and shut it off. It happened the same way most big changes in human history happen, quietly, incrementally, one small convenience at a time. Picture this. For almost all of human existence, your nervous system evolved in a world with no straight lines, no constant buzzing, no glowing rectangles. Your ancestors woke up to birdsong, shifting wind, the smell of wet soil. Their attention was pulled outward, into the world. The slightest change in temperature, a new scent on the breeze, a distant rustle in the grass. These weren't background noise. They were information, signals, clues that could mean food, danger, shelter, opportunity. Their sixth sense, this deep, whole-body awareness, was constantly being trained, refined, rewarded. Now jump to today. You wake up in a room with sealed windows, constant temperature, and artificially filtered air. The first thing your hand reaches for isn't the ground, or a nearby branch, or the warmth of a fire. It's a smartphone. Before your feet even touch the floor, your nervous system has been hijacked, not by a predator, not by a thunderstorm, by a stream of notifications, headlines, messages, and glowing icons designed to capture your attention more efficiently than any rustle in the grass ever could. For early humans, attention was about survival. For modern humans, attention is a commodity, and that shift might be the final break between us and our ancestral sixth sense. Because your sixth sense isn't magic. It's not some airy, mystical extra. It's what happens when your brain and body are fully tuned to the environment around you. But what happens when the environment around you is a screen? Smartphones did something nothing in human history had done before. They created a portable bubble of elsewhere. You can be standing on a sidewalk with wind on your face, cars passing, birds overhead, people's footsteps echoing behind you, and your mind is 100% somewhere else, in a conversation thread, in an argument that ended 3 hours ago, in a video shot on the other side of the planet. Your body is here, your awareness is not. Over time, the brain learns what matters. It stops prioritizing the slow, subtle signals of the physical world and focuses instead on the fast, loud signals of the digital one. The ping of a message becomes more important than the shift in light that tells you a storm is coming. A red notification bubble feels more urgent than the subtle discomfort that says you're tired, thirsty, or overwhelmed. Your nervous system, shaped by millions of years to notice small changes in your surroundings, is now being trained to notice only the things that flash, blink, vibrate, or scroll. Constant connectivity doesn't just occupy your time, it rewires your instincts about what deserves your attention, and that's where the disconnection begins. Because the sixth sense, this quiet, integrative awareness we've been tracing through our species' history, depends on a simple condition. You have to be present where your body is. Modern life makes that increasingly rare. Now think about where most humans live. For the first time in our history, the majority of our species is urban. Cities of glass, concrete, and steel. Climate-controlled towers, grids of streets, predictable lighting, flattened terrain. We've done something extraordinary from an engineering perspective. We have tamed unpredictability. The wild world runs on subtle variability. Wind direction changing by a few degrees, birds migrating earlier than usual, the way shadows stretch as the sun arcs lower in the sky. Our ancestors were immersed in this. Their nervous systems learned its rhythms the way you might learn a favorite song, unconsciously, intimately, completely. Cities strip most of that away. Day and night are softened by artificial lighting. Temperature changes are flattened by heating and air conditioning. Ground is replaced by pavement. Soil is something in a bag at the hardware store. Trees are decorative, not informational. The environment stops being a source of signals and becomes a backdrop. Urban living doesn't just separate us from nature, it separates us from the training ground our sixth sense evolved in. In a forest, you can't help but notice the crack of a branch, the sudden silence of insects, the smell of rain starting miles away. These details tug at your awareness, demand interpretation. Your whole perceptual system is asked to participate. In a city, you can ignore almost everything and still survive. You can cross streets guided only by coloured lights and crosswalk signals. You can eat food that comes from nowhere in particular. You can drink water without ever seeing the river. You don't need to know where the sun rises or what phase the moon is in. You can go months without touching uncultivated ground. When the world stops asking your sixth sense to show up, it starts to fade from disuse. Psychologists have a phrase for one slice of this problem: nature deficit disorder. It's not a clinical diagnosis. It's a way of describing what happens when human beings, especially children, grow up with almost no direct contact with the natural world. Researchers have noticed patterns. Kids who spend less time outdoors tend to have more trouble with attention, higher levels of anxiety, less emotional regulation. Adults report feeling foggy, numb, or disconnected when they haven't been in natural environments for long stretches. At first, this looks like a mental health story, but underneath, it's also a sensory story. In nature, your perceptual systems are fed a rich, complex diet. The fractal patterns of leaves, the irregular sound of wind, the constantly shifting play of the light and shadow. Your brain evolved to digest that. When it does, something strange happens. You feel calmer, yet more alert. Rested, yet more awake. It's as if the nervous system is saying, "This is the environment I was built for." In purely artificial environments, the diet changes. Instead of fractals, you get straight lines. Instead of irregular organic sounds, you get constant hums and mechanical drones. Instead of subtle gradients of light, you get on, off, bright, dim, screen, not screen. This doesn't destroy your basic five senses. You can still see, hear, touch, smell, and taste perfectly well. But that deeper integrative awareness, the quiet synthesis beneath them, stops getting the right kind of input. Nature deficit disorder isn't just about missing trees. It's about starving an entire layer of perception that only fully switches on when you're embedded in a living landscape. And on top of this sensory starvation, we've layered something else: information overload. Our ancestors dealt with complexity, but it was local. Seasonal patterns, social relationships, changes in animal behavior, the appearance or disappearance of certain plants. They had to track a lot, but it was all anchored to the land they moved through and the small number of people around them. Now imagine showing that same nervous system, because biologically it's still yours, an endless scroll of wars, disasters, opinions, memes, statistics, advertisements, and personal updates from hundreds of people you barely know. Modern humans are exposed in a single day to more symbolic information than our ancestors might have encountered in months. The brain tries to cope. It shortcuts, it filters, it narrows, it learns to skim instead of sink in. It reacts instead of listens. This is efficient for surviving in a digital flood, but terrible for subtle perception. The sixth sense depends on your ability to notice the quietest signal in the room, the knot in your stomach that doesn't match the words someone is saying, the slight unease you feel before entering a place, the gentle pull toward a path you can't logically justify, but somehow know is safer. These signals are small. They don't shout. They whisper. But if your nervous system is already at maximum capacity, juggling headlines, messages, deadlines, and 1,000 stray pieces of information, there's no bandwidth left for whispers. Information overload doesn't just make you tired. It drowns out the very channels where intuitive information tends to arrive. Researchers are beginning to notice something else. When they compare people who grew up in heavily urbanized, screen-saturated environments with those who spend more time in natural or traditional settings, they find differences not just in stress levels, but in perception and intuition. Indigenous trackers can read faint impressions in the ground that most modern eyes simply don't see. Farmers who've lived on the same land for generations can sense subtle shifts in weather long before a storm appears on any radar. Arctic hunters can navigate whiteout conditions using only wind, sound, and the feel of the snow under their feet. These aren't magical powers. They're examples of a sixth sense that's been allowed to develop, reinforced by a lifetime of feedback from the natural world. In contrast, people from dense, high-tech cities often show something else: difficulty noticing body sensations, confusion about inner states, reliance on external data over internal signals. Ask, what does your gut say? And many literally don't know. The channel has gone quiet. Some studies even hint that regular time in nature restores not just mood and attention, but something more mysterious: improved decision-making, better pattern recognition, a more accurate feeling for what's right in ambiguous situations. In other words, a more responsive sixth sense. If that's true, then it raises an uncomfortable question. What exactly have we traded away? We gained antibiotics, electricity, instant communication, global travel. We gained safety from predators, shelter from storms, the ability to carry the world's knowledge in our pockets. But in the process, we might have surrendered an older form of safety. One that didn't come from firewalls and insurance policies. One that came from a body and mind so tuned to their environment that danger rarely arrived as a surprise. We might have lost a kind of navigation, not the blue dot on a map, but the felt sense of where you should and shouldn't go. Not the algorithm telling you what to watch next, but the quiet inner yes or no that used to guide who you trusted, what you ate, when you rested, when you moved. Modern life has given us extraordinary control over the outer world, but at the same time, it has quietly loosened our connection to the inner one. The sixth sense hasn't vanished. It's still there, embedded in the same nervous system that carried your ancestors through ice ages and droughts. But it's been smothered under layers of noise, convenience, and artificial certainty. The question now isn't whether it existed. It's whether we're willing to feel what we lost, and whether it's still possible to bring it back. To find out, we have to turn to the one thing that never lies: evidence. What does modern science actually say about our hidden senses? And is there proof that this ancient intuition is still alive beneath the static of modern life? That's where we're going next. Picture this. You're lying in bed, lights off, eyes closed. No screens, no noise, nothing obvious happening at all. And yet, you feel something. Maybe it's a shift in the room, a subtle sense that someone just walked past the door, or that your phone is about to buzz. No sound, no sight, no touch, just a quiet knowing. For most of history, that feeling would have been taken seriously. It might have meant danger, or weather, or the movement of animals nearby. Today, we shrug it off as imagination. But scientists have been quietly testing these strange whispers of perception, and what they're finding is unsettling, because piece by piece, the evidence is piling up that our so-called sixth sense never fully disappeared. It just slipped beneath the surface, into places we forgot to look. Let's start with the most alien of them all, magnetoreception, the sense of Earth's magnetic field. We used to think this was reserved for other animals, migratory birds using invisible lines of force to travel thousands of miles, sea turtles navigating oceans with accuracy no GPS could match, salmon finding the exact stream where they were born. Humans, we thought, didn't do that. We had maps and compasses and satellites now. We'd outgrown it. Except, maybe we didn't. In 2019, a team of researchers in California placed people in a completely dark shielded chamber. No light, no sound, no cues. Around the chamber, they rotated a carefully controlled magnetic field, mimicking changes in Earth's field as if the person's head were turning. Consciously, the volunteers felt nothing. No tingling, no dizziness, no sense of motion. But their brains disagreed. Electrodes on their scalps picked up clear shifts in brainwaves, alpha rhythms dropping and changing, precisely when the magnetic field rotated in specific ways. Not all directions worked, just those matching the natural alignment of Earth's field in the region where the experiment was done. Most people never noticed anything. No bright flash of intuition, no inner compass lighting up. But deep in the background, their nervous systems were reacting, quietly, automatically, like an ancient program still running in the operating system long after the user forgot it was there. And then there's cryptochrome, a light-sensitive protein in our eyes. In birds, cryptochrome reacts to both light and magnetic fields, letting them literally see the invisible structure of Earth's magnetism as patterns laid over the world. For years, biologists found this protein in migrating animals and said, of course, they need it. Then they found it in human eyes too. We aren't seeing glowing navigation lines in the sky. We don't consciously feel the magnetic field. Yet we carry the same molecular machinery as animals that do. A system refined over millions of years, sitting inside us, mostly unused, or at least unrecognized. Evolution doesn't keep costly, complex systems around for no reason. So maybe the question isn't, do humans have a magnetic sense? But how much of it have we forgotten how to listen to? But not all hidden senses point outward. Some point inward. Deep in your torso, wrapped around your intestines, there's something scientists call the enteric nervous system. It's not a cute metaphor. It's literally a network of hundreds of millions of neurons embedded in your gut. Enough nerve cells to rival a cat's brain, your second brain. It doesn't think in words, it doesn't do algebra. But it tracks something far more important to a survival-driven animal: safety. When you walk into a room and feel something's off before you can say why, your gut is part of that calculation. It's monitoring hormones, heart rate, subtle shifts in breathing, the tension in your muscles, the micro-expressions on other people's faces, the tiniest changes in their smell. It feeds all of that into a simple binary question: safe or not? If you've ever had your stomach drop for no reason, only to learn later there was indeed something wrong, someone lying, a danger nearby, a situation about to go bad, you've felt that hidden network in action. For our ancestors, this wasn't mystical, it was survival. On the savannah, hesitation could mean death. You didn't always have time for slow, conscious reasoning. You needed fast, embodied judgments. Trust the gut. Move now. Explain later. Today, we call those gut feelings intuition. But physiologically, they're a kind of sixth sense, a vast sensor fusion system integrating signals from the body, the environment, and other people long before the conscious mind writes a story about what's going on. Some scientists have pushed this idea even further into territory that borders on the uncanny. They study something called presentiment. The setup is simple. Hook people up to devices that track sweat gland activity, heart rate, tiny changes in skin conductance. Then flash images on a screen, some neutral, landscapes, chairs, everyday objects, and some emotionally intense accidents, snarling animals, disturbing scenes. The order is randomized by a computer. Participants don't know what's coming next. In theory, their bodies shouldn't either, but in some experiments, those silent physiological signals, the invisible whispers from the nervous system, seem to react a fraction of a second before the disturbing images appear. Not all scientists agree on what this means. Some say it's noise in the data or flaws in the statistics. Others say maybe it's just people picking up on subtle patterns they're not consciously aware of. A few argue it might hint at something stranger about time and perception, our bodies sampling the near future in ways we don't yet understand. No one has a definitive answer. But the pattern itself is intriguing. Again and again, the body seems to be a step ahead of the mind. You don't have to accept the most dramatic interpretation to see what's important here. Your conscious awareness is not the first responder. It's the narrator that arrives a moment late, looks around at what your body already did, and then explains it. Your sixth sense might not be prophecy. It might just be speed. Your deeper systems reacting long before your inner voice catches up. Meanwhile, there's another channel of information we almost never notice, and yet it shapes our lives every day. Chemical communication. We like to think of ourselves as visual, verbal creatures. We look, we talk, we listen. We don't sniff the air like dogs or wolves, and we certainly don't think we navigate the world through smell the way ants and bees do. But buried under our modern perfumes, soaps and deodorants, something older is still at work. Pheromones. In insects, pheromones are obvious. One ant lays a chemical trail and the whole colony follows. One moth releases a molecule into the night, and males detect it from miles away. Humans are subtler. We don't have a single molecule that controls us like that, but we do emit complex blends of chemosignals through sweat, breath, skin, that other people pick up and react to unconsciously. Experiments have shown that women living together tend to synchronize their menstrual cycles over time, likely influenced by scent cues. Men exposed to trace amounts of female tears show measurable drops in testosterone and arousal, even though they can't consciously detect any smell. Other studies suggest that we can, without realizing it, distinguish between the scent of strangers and close relatives, and that we're often more attracted to people whose immune system genes are different from our own, an ancient mechanism for producing healthier offspring. You don't smell immune genes. You don't think, this person's MHC complex is highly complementary to mine. You just get a feeling, attraction, comfort, unease. Chemical messages slip past conscious filters, shaping mood, preference, even trust. Another silent sense, working in the background. Then there's the one we're most familiar with, and yet least willing to call a sense. First impressions. Psychologists have tested this in countless ways. Show people a photograph of a stranger's face for half a second, too fast to analyze consciously, and ask them to rate how competent, trustworthy, or likable that person seems. Later, compare those snap judgments to what that person actually does in real life. Job performance, election outcomes, even courtroom decisions. Again and again, those instant impressions track real-world outcomes better than chance. In some studies, people watch a silent 30-second clip of a teacher, no sound, no content, just body language. Their ratings of teaching quality match closely with students who spent an entire semester in that classroom. We don't fully understand how this works, but it seems our brains are performing rapid pattern recognition on micro-expressions, posture, gaze direction, skin color changes, tiny movements we don't know we're noticing. A fast-acting filter evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of social living. In a small band on the savannah, misjudging character could be fatal. Trusting the wrong person, following the wrong leader, ignoring subtle signs of aggression or instability, any of these could destroy a group. So natural selection favoured individuals whose nervous systems could make lightning-fast, reasonably accurate calls about others, without waiting for slow, logical reasoning. Today we call it thin slicing rapid cognition. Strip away the jargon, and it's another form of sensing, extracting complex information from minimal input, often bypassing conscious thought entirely. Magnetic fields your brain responds to but you don't notice. A second brain in your gut sounding silent alarms. Bodies reacting before the mind knows why. Chemical conversations carried in breath and sweat. Instant judgments that often prove more accurate than carefully weighed analysis. These aren't telepathy or magic. They're subtler. Layers of perception that never stopped working even as we stopped listening. Our sixth sense, it seems, didn't vanish in some ancient catastrophe. It wasn't surgically removed by agriculture, or crushed by cities, or erased by smartphones. It just sank, down into the body, down into the blind spots of consciousness, down into the hidden architecture of nerves and cells that have been doing this work since long before we called it anything at all. The scientific picture that's emerging isn't one of a lost superpower waiting to be switched back on with the right ritual or gadget. It's stranger than that. It suggests we are already swimming in more information than we can consciously handle. That our ancestors evolved ways to process it automatically, through magnetosensitive proteins, gut networks, unconscious reflexes, chemical, signals and fast social judgments, and that our modern minds, obsessed with what can be named and measured, simply stopped giving those channels a seat at the table. But ignoring a sense doesn't erase it. It just makes it go quiet, like a voice in another room, still talking, still warning, still guiding, while we turn up the volume on our thoughts and convince ourselves we're alone. The question, then, isn't whether the sixth sense exists. The evidence suggests it does, in many overlapping forms. The question is whether any of it can be brought back into awareness, whether those faint whispers can be heard again, not as superstition, but as a deeper layer of what it means to be human. And that is where our story goes next. So here we are, modern humans with ancient hardware, brains forged by ice ages and lightning storms, living under fluorescent lights and phone screens. For hours you've heard how much we've lost. The question that hangs in the dark now is simple. Is it gone forever, or just sleeping? If those heightened senses were carved into our nervous system by millions of years of evolution, they don't just vanish in a few thousand years of city life. Biology doesn't hit delete that easily. It hides things. It turns them down. It reroutes attention. What feels like lost might really be ignored. And that's where the reawakening begins. Not with magic powers, not with instant enlightenment, with attention. Picture this. You're sitting in a quiet room, lights low, phone face down, no music, no notifications, nothing demanding anything from you. At first your brain protests. It looks for something to scroll, something to fix, some new emergency. But if you stay, something begins to shift. You start to notice your breathing, the slight coolness of the air as it enters your nose, the warmth as it leaves, the tiny pause at the top of each inhale that you never noticed before. then your heartbeat. Faint at first, like footsteps in another room, then clearer, the slight pulsing in your fingertips, the background hum of your own body that's always there, but rarely heard. This is meditation stripped down to its core, not incense and mantras, but training your attention to turn inward and stay there long enough to actually see what's already happening. For our ancestors, this kind of awareness wasn't a spiritual hobby, it was survival. If you couldn't feel your own fatigue, you'd overhunt and injure yourself. If you couldn't sense your own fear clearly, you'd either freeze when you needed to run or charge when you needed to hide. Interoception, your sense of the inner body, was part of the sixth sense toolkit. Modern mindfulness practices are, in a strange way, a hack, a way to get back into systems that evolution built, but culture buried. Dozens of brain imaging studies show that regular meditation changes the physical structure of your brain. Regions involved in attention, emotional regulation, and sensory processing literally thicken, connections strengthen, noise quiets, neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself throughout life. For most of human history, neuroplasticity was the default setting. Every migration, every drought, every new animal to track demanded new neural wiring. Today, most of our rewiring goes into learning interfaces and algorithms, but the same machinery can still be aimed at something older. When scientists put experienced meditators into brain scanners, something curious shows up. Sensory areas, especially those linked to body awareness, light up more strongly and more efficiently. It's as if the brain is saying, "Oh, this again. I remember how to do this. Let me reopen those pathways." That's the first clue that the sixth sense might not be gone, just underused. But awareness of your inner world is only half the story. The other half is the outer world. For almost all of our evolutionary history, your ancestors slept under real darkness, woke to real dawn, walked on real dirt. Their feet felt every stone. Their skin read the air like a book. Now imagine taking that nervous system and putting it in a high-rise apartment with sealed windows, artificial light at midnight, traffic noise at 3 a.m, blue screens at arm's length. The sensory environment is not just different, it's distorted. So how do you retune a brain that evolved for forests and savannas, but lives in concrete and glass? You go back to the source. There's a reason so many people report that their thoughts change after just a few hours in nature. Time slows down. Edges soften. Problems seem less sharp, less urgent. This isn't just poetic language, it's measurable. Researchers in Japan gave it a name: forest bathing. Not swimming in rivers, just existing in a forest intentionally, walking slowly, breathing, letting the full spectrum of natural sensory input hit your nervous system without trying to control it. When they measured what happened, the results were almost embarrassingly clear. Heart rate dropped, blood pressure lowered, stress hormones like cortisol fell, immune cells that fight viruses and even cancer increased. Brain waves shifted toward the slower rhythms associated with relaxation and integration. But something subtler was happening too. People reported feeling more connected, more aware, more themselves. Their perception of time changed. Sounds felt layered instead of flat. Colours felt richer. They could feel tiny shifts in wind and light they'd normally overlook. Forest bathing wasn't giving them new senses, it was taking away the interference. In the lab, controlled experiments show that time in nature improves something psychologists call directed attention, your ability to hold focus on what you choose instead of being yanked around by every passing stimulus. When that stabilizes, your sensitivity to quieter signals goes up. Signals like the faint change in temperature before a storm, the subtle tension in your own jaw that tells you you're more anxious than you thought, the almost imperceptible change in another person's posture that hints at what they're not saying. Pieces of the sixth sense, flickering back on. Now combine meditation, the training of inward attention, with nature, the restoration of outward attention. You get a brain that's no longer dominated by noise, that has spare capacity again. Capacity to pick up on the very faint patterns that our ancestors read as easily as we read text. But there's still one giant obstacle, the most powerful distraction device ever created, your phone. Technologically speaking, the past 20 years have done something no ice age, no volcanic eruption, no predator ever managed. They've put a competing agenda into your sensory field 24 hours a day, an attention parasite. Every vibration, every alert, every red notification dot is designed to hijack the same ancient systems that once helped you hear a twig snap or smell smoke on the wind. When people voluntarily reduce their technology use, even slightly, their baseline perception changes shockingly fast. In digital detox experiments, participants report that after a few days without constant screens, sounds feel louder, food tastes stronger, their emotional gut feelings become clearer. It's not that the world got louder or tastier or more meaningful, it's that the static dropped. Neuroplasticity works both ways. Just as repeated meditation can strengthen circuits for inner awareness, repeated distraction can strengthen circuits for fragmentation. The good news is that the brain doesn't care what you practice. It will get better at whatever you do most. Scrolling trains you to skim, silence trains you to notice, nature trains you to integrate, meditation trains you to witness. The sixth sense, in whatever form you define it, intuition, subtle perception, embodied knowing, isn't one magic region in the brain. It's the emergent property of many systems working together smoothly. Body sense, emotional mapping, pattern recognition, long-term memory, social attunement. The more noise you remove, the more those systems can talk to each other again. Neuroscientists studying experienced meditators, elite athletes, and expert trackers find something similar in all three groups. Brain networks that are usually at odds, task-focused networks and introspective networks, start to work in sync instead of in competition. This synchronized state lets people maintain high awareness of their own internal state, while staying exquisitely tuned to the external environment. Exactly what a hunter on the savannah needed, exactly what a parent in a crowded city still needs. Think about intuition for a moment, that gut feeling that something is off before you can say why. It's not magic, it's your brain detecting a pattern faster than your conscious mind can put it into words, a micro-expression on someone's face, a tiny mismatch between tone and content, a context that doesn't fit what usually happens in this place at this time. Your ancestors relied on this constantly. Is that silence in the forest normal, or is something watching? Is that animal's gait healthy, or is it injured and easier to hunt? Is that stranger's stance friendly, or is there tension in the shoulders that suggests danger? Modern life drowns that signal in noise, messages, feeds, advertisements, constant novelty. Your pattern recognition systems never get time to consolidate to say, I've seen this before, here's what usually follows. So intuition feels random, unreliable, like a superstition. But when people train attention, reduce noise, and give their brain time to integrate, through sleep, silence, nature, reflection, intuition starts to come back online, not as fortune-telling, as faster, deeper sensing. The science of neuroplasticity says there's no hard cut-off point. Even in older adults, new connections can form, dormant pathways can wake, blind people can repurpose their visual cortex to enhance touch and sound, Deaf people can turn auditory regions into language processing hubs. The brain is not fragile crystal, it's living clay. If entire sensory systems can be reassigned in a few years, what else might be possible? A more refined sense of space, a more accurate read on your own emotions, a sharper awareness of the vibe of a room, a clearer felt sense of when to move forward and when to wait. These aren't paranormal gifts, they're extensions of what's already documented. So no, the sixth sense is not a fantasy that science will someday prove or disprove with a single experiment. It's a spectrum of capacities that culture can either numb or nourish. Every time you sit quietly and notice your breath without immediately reaching for stimulation, you're tilting that spectrum. Every time you walk outside without headphones, listening to the actual world instead of a curated one, you're tilting it. Every evening you dim the lights before bed, letting your ancient circadian rhythms feel something that resembles dusk. You're telling a very old brain you're allowed to work the way you were built. Reawakening doesn't mean regressing. No one is asking you to move back into a cave or throw your phone into a river. Our ancestors adapted to shifting climates and new technologies constantly. The real inheritance of the bottleneck survivors isn't a single sense. It's adaptability itself. You can use modern tools to train ancient systems, meditation apps to guide awareness inward, GPS to take you to wild places that would be hard to reach otherwise. Science to confirm that what you feel on a deep forest walk isn't just in your head, it's in your nervous system, your immune system, your brain waves. Some capacities may be gone in their original form. Few of us will ever track an animal for 3 days by faint scuffs in the dirt and broken grass. But the underlying circuitry that made that possible, sustained attention, pattern recognition, embodied awareness, that's still here, waiting, like a sense that has been asleep for a very long time. And maybe that's the most hopeful part of the story. The sixth sense was never a separate mystical organ that we tore out and threw away. It was a way of using everything we already have at full resolution, tuned to the faintest signals in and around us. We turned the volume down to survive the noise of our own inventions. Now, in the quiet moments, we can turn it back up. So here we are, at the end of a very long story that began with a few thousand frightened primates huddled in the dark, listening for the slightest crack of a twig in the night, and ends with you, lying in bed, listening to this on a glowing screen. From razor-sharp awareness to constant distraction. From a world where every sound and shadow mattered to a world where the loudest thing is usually a notification. Somewhere along that journey, we didn't just build cities, agriculture, science, and smartphones. We also built walls around a part of our own perception. But that sixth sense, that quiet inner compass, didn't vanish. Evolution doesn't throw away tools that are useful. It gets buried. It gets drowned out. It gets mislabeled as a feeling, a vibe, just a hunch. Yet underneath all the noise of modern life, the same nervous system that kept your ancestors alive through ice ages and bottlenecks is still humming away, still sampling the world, still whispering to you in ways you almost remember but can't quite name. You've seen its shadow in this story, in the meta-population of scattered bands that somehow stayed connected, in the hunters who could read wind, animal tracks, and the moods of their companions as fluently as language, in the sailors who crossed open water with no compass, in farmers who could smell the rain coming days away, in shamans and mystics who wrapped this subtle sense in symbols and rituals because they had no better words for it. Then came the revolutions, agriculture, writing, cities, science, industry, technology. Each step made us safer from some dangers and more vulnerable to others. We learned to measure almost everything, except the feeling of standing in a forest and suddenly knowing we're being watched. The chill when a storm is 3 ridges away. the strange accuracy of a gut decision that makes no logical sense and yet turns out to be right. That is the lost sense we've been circling around all along. Not magic, not superpowers, just the full bandwidth of a human nervous system running at capacity, tuned to the world instead of to a screen. And here's the important part. Understanding that we lost it is the first step toward reclaiming it. Because once you see the pattern, you can start to work with it. You can experiment. You can treat your own life the way a scientist treats a field site, or the way a hunter treats a landscape. Notice how your body feels walking through a city versus under trees. Notice how your breathing changes when you put your phone in another room. Notice the difference between anxiety shouting and intuition quietly tugging at your sleeve. You don't have to move into a cave or throw away your devices. You can begin with small, almost invisible changes. 5 minutes outside with no headphones, watching the way shadows shift as the sun goes down, listening for layers of sound instead of just the loudest one, paying attention to the first micro-impression you get when you meet someone before the stories and judgments rush in. Every time you do this, you're sending a signal back down the long chain of your ancestry. You're telling your nervous system, this information matters again. You're loosening, just a little, the filters that civilization tightened. You're making room for that quiet voice within to speak a little more clearly. And over time, if you keep listening, you may notice that the world starts to feel a bit more alive, not just as a backdrop for your thoughts, but as something you're in constant dialogue with. Your attention becomes less like a spotlight and more like a wide, soft lantern. You start to sense patterns, currents, tiny shifts, the way your ancestors once did because they had to. You don't have to, you get to. If you've made it this far, through ancient bottlenecks and forgotten senses, through Neanderthals and night skies, thank you for walking this path with me. Thank you for letting this story keep you company as you drift towards sleep or sit awake in the dark, wondering what else might be possible for a human mind. If you'd like more journeys like this, more deep dives into the hidden corners of our history and our potential, it really does help if you gently tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You can even tell me where in the world you're listening from right now. A quiet bedroom in a crowded city, a farmhouse miles from the nearest streetlight, a dorm room, a cabin, a tiny apartment with a single window looking at the stars. Those little messages are like echoes from distant campsites, reminders that this strange, sprawling human family is still connected. And if you feel called to support this channel a little more, there is an optional YouTube membership you can join. It's completely up to you. Never required, never expected. This content will always be here, free, for anyone who needs a voice in the dark and a story to fall asleep to. But if you choose to become a member, know that you're helping keep these stories going, helping us keep exploring the edges of what it means to be human. For now, let the noise of the day recede. Feel your breath slow and steady. Feel the weight of your body, the softness beneath you, the faint sounds around you. This is your world. This is your nervous system tasting it. Somewhere, deep inside, the same ancient circuitry that once watched the savannah is still awake, still listening. All you have to do is listen back.